Well, welcome back to AHIC Rewind, where we show speakers from our vast content library and those that we believe are inspirational and motivational. For this episode, I'm delighted to welcome to the Rewind stage a remarkable man who has spoken at my events in both Berlin and Dubai over the years and described by the Guinness Book of World Records as the world's greatest living explorer. And that is none other than the amazing Sir Ranulph Fiennes. He was first to reach both the North and South Pole by surface, the first to completely cross the Antarctic on foot and unsupported, first to circumnavigate the world along its polar axis, and at the age of 65, he climbed to the summit of Mount Everest. And these are just a few of his 6 decades of record-breaking challenges. He is also author of 24 fiction and nonfiction books, a highly competitive man who digs deep to achieve his goals. If you weren't in person to hear this keynote, and even if you were, it's pretty special to listen to this rewind and what makes this man tick. Enjoy this awesome keynote from AHIC 2018.
Don't go anywhere, and indeed I hope more will come in, because this is a moment where we switch to what really is the star billing of our show today. We've got a very special guest with us, and by way of introduction, you need to get my... I was enjoying sitting down, but I'll stand up. By way of introduction, I just want to say that, you know, when I was a kid, I was somewhat obsessed with the idea of travel, which I guess is why I became a globe-trotting journalist. But I was fascinated by the stories of all the great explorers, you know, the sort of Christopher Columbus and Magellan and even Marco Polo and all of these amazing stories. And, you know, you look at our world today and the degree to which our planet is now so full of people, and it's so urbanized, and it feels so full and so busy, and you think sometimes to yourself, there's nowhere left to explore or to discover or to have a genuine solo adventure. But of course, that isn't strictly true. And the one individual in the whole world who perhaps best personifies the fact that that isn't true, and that one can still push the limits of human endurance, the spirit of adventure, and curiosity, push those limits to the very edge of survival. The one individual who shows that more than any other is our guest today. I'm not going to describe all of his amazing journeys and missions to the most remote, the most difficult and dangerous corners of our planet, because he's going to tell you a lot about those himself. Suffice to say that he has done everything from visit on foot and in the most extraordinary circumstances, the 2 poles. He, after heart surgery, climbed Mount Everest. The stories of adventure and daring do from this man are absolutely incredible. So it is my privilege and my honor to introduce to you, by way of video first, before you meet him in person, but by way of video first, please enjoy the life, the times, the adventures of Sir Ranulph Fiennes.
Thank you very much. مرحبا. شكرا من شان أنا هنا. أنا موجود هنا تقريبا سنة 1968 في جيش من عمان. ولكن أنا أنسان كل كلمات عربي. عفوا إذا أنا أتكلم الحين في إنجليزي. I'm going to speak for, well, I'm hoping to show some photographs of some of the package holidays which we've been doing for 45 years. And when I say we, I'm talking about our group. There's 52 people in the group. We don't always use them on every expedition. Sometimes there might only be 2. But 52 of them from 9 different countries, and pretty much all of them have got nothing in common other than the fact that I have never paid anybody anything at any time. So there is no financial motivation in coming, and yet they are still coming 45 years later. Basically, over that period, I have to say that some of them are not still coming because they're dead, but the rest, yeah. We have a 40% failure rate over what we have been trying to do, which is basically to break world records of a geographical and physical nature. And when we do succeed, what you do is to make a lot of noise about it in the media, because that is what your sponsor wants. And to us, the sponsor is vital. No expeditions without sponsors. Also, if you do get there, what you do is you put your flag before anybody else puts their flag in the same place. In our case, especially the Norwegians. We do not call them rival, we call them enemy, because that way our group sort of tries harder. I think the key is to choose the right people, and I used to be in charge of selecting them. And when I'm looking at somebody maybe to take them on, I don't give them 1 out of 10 on their characteristics or anything complex like that. I only go for their motivational factor, because how somebody is motivated is how they behave for themselves and therefore for their company or their expedition group. So before an interview, I need a clear definition of motivation. And you probably don't remember a famous Irish psychologist was asked to define motivation in a single sentence. He obviously did not do that, because the Irish cannot define anything in a single sentence. But what he did say is that motivation is something which happens to everybody when they're a teenager. They go to university, they meet a professor who they respect, who one day says something illuminating which sticks in their head and forms the basis of their motivation through life thereafter, which is actually a load of rubbish. In fact, how you are motivated is the sum total of everything which has happened to you since you were very small. Basically, I think that when we are choosing people on the motivational factor, you've got to realize that it could not be just that they learn their motivation when they are quite old. Some of them get it as genetic. If you're born stupid, you'll probably stay stupid. If you go to school and you get badly bullied, this can have a big effect on how you interact socially for a long time, even if you don't know it. And I think the system of only choosing people on the motivational side normally works very well, except I have been in a hostile area for 2 months with somebody, thought they were brilliant, and then noticed a flaw in their character which could be dangerous later on. And I have to say, in our group, if we notice something like that, what we do is to sack them immediately. None of this sort of sideways British promotional pussyfooting, which just keeps your rotten apple in the barrel. I think in terms of my own motivation, probably goes back to when I got born in Windsor, outside the castle, obviously, at a time when it was being bombed during the war, which my mother did not like. So she moved all of my sisters and me, aged 1, out to South Africa for 12 years without consulting us. And I have to say, it was a very nice place to get brought up, except that academically, way behind the UK. Today, it may be the other way around, but that's the way it was. So when we all got back, I was 12 years old. My mum had no money. She was looking for somewhere to educate us and was very happy when she found a place called Winchester College, which took anybody totally free of charge if your family name was Fiennes. This was because the man that built the college 800 years ago had been called Fiennes and liked the idea of lots of little Fienneses going there free. Also because there were very few of us at that time, so it was economically safe for the college. But more recently, we started to breed like rabbits, mostly actors, and it became unsafe for the college. So they changed the rules, and after that, you could only get in free if you got the top level of entrance exam. And due to my African background, I got the bottom level, and they would not accept me, to my mother's disappointment. In fact, the only place which would take people with such a low level of intellect was, of course, Eton College. So I went there for about 5 years, but my level was so low I couldn't even keep up with theirs. But luckily there was boxing, which did not require too much intelligence, and also, of course, stegophilie. Stegophilie is if you get born with an edifice complex, meaning you like to climb tall buildings at night in order to put things on top to annoy the school authorities. And over those 5 years at Eton, I learned, I think in the 1950s, British architects stopped using proper steel drain pipes outside buildings, like you've got here, switched to nasty plastic ones, which very often break when you get up to the 4th floor. So from an academic viewpoint, therefore, Eton was not a total waste of time. But going back to motivation, my mother realized that if I stayed there, I would not be able to do the only thing that I wanted to do since I was little, which was to become the commanding officer of the Royal Scots Greys Cavalry Regiment, which my dad had been commanding when he got killed in the war. Now, in his day, the regiment had 600 horses, quite romantic, and also if you wanted to get to be a regular British officer, you did not require exams called A-levels. By the time I arrived, the regiment had switched from horses to 60-ton tanks, and to be an officer, regular officer, you had to pass your A-level exams. So my mother removed me from Eton, because she knew if I stayed there I would not get them. Places badly designed for getting people A-levels. And I was sent to a famous place in Aldershot called Mons Cadet School. And if you went there, when you came out the other end, you definitely had your A-level exams. And I'm not at all proud of having broken their record. This was not my fault. It was because at that time was the height of the mini-skirt era, and concentration was therefore not possible. So I failed the A-levels twice. But if you can't get where you want, like Sandhurst College, you've got to find an alternate route. And I found a place in Aldershot called Mons Cadet School. And if you went there for 5 months and could prove to the Sergeant Major that under a situation of great stress, you could dig holes in straight lines, you could become an officer in the British Army. I did this, and I got sent out to Germany. It was the Cold War at that time, and I spent the next 5 years in 60-ton tanks learning how to retreat from the German border. Did not practice advancing, which got boring. So when I saw a notice on the regimental board in Scotland asking for officers to apply for the SAS, the Special Air Service, I put my name down, not because I knew anything about the SAS. In those days, nobody had ever heard of them. It was before Harold Wilson started to use them for PR purposes. I had obviously heard of Scandinavian Airline Services, but not the regiment. So I got sent to Hereford, which is where you go to get selected for the regiment. There were 390 soldiers trying to get in, 30 other officers, pretty much all of them built like brick houses, ex-para. None of them came from a cavalry regiment. They called me a donkey walloper. So I was quite happy when these guys got ruthlessly eliminated in only 10 days, down to only 3 soldiers and 2 officers. And to my surprise, I was still there. I think probably because they were choosing people from a physical, not intelligence point of view. But unfortunately, on the 11th day, they switched. So I had to try to become alert. And I can remember, if you failed anything, you got thrown out immediately. And what me and the other remaining officer were having to do one night was to cross the local river by night in winter with no clothes on for some military reason. So I woke up extremely knackered the following morning at about 11 o'clock. You're meant to get up at 6 o'clock, and I panicked because they leave your instructions every day on your bed. And what it was that particular day was to steal £200,000 from the local bank in great detail, which the SAS check. I had Barclays, the other officer had Lloyd's. So I rushed down to the town, but the bank was already closed, so I could not get in to do a careful burglary plan. So I went round the back and I banged on the back window, and luckily the bank manager came out, charming man, very naive, and I explained I had come from Germany. I was trying to get into the SAS. So I had brought all my family silver with me. This bit was not true. And he said, no problem. We at Barclays are very secure. He showed me all the electronic burglar system. So I thanked him. In those days, carbon paper, I copied the bank raid plan in great detail, 1 copy to the SAS, and the other guy and me had the day off. So we went up to Birmingham. We saw a film and had a spaghetti dinner. And very stupidly after dinner, I left my copy of the bank raid plan in the restaurant. And the manager, later in court, basically gave the plans to the police. There was a ministerial inquiry in Westminster, front page of the Times, why SAS officers were stealing from banks. I was up before the commanding officer, who basically said any more behavior like that and I would be thrown out of the SAS immediately. Well, for the next year or two in different parts of the world in the SAS, I was doing various things. Back in the UK, unfortunately, I got phoned by an old Eton friend who by that time, like most of them, had become a wine salesman in the West Country. And during the course of selling his stuff in pubs, he had discovered a village called Castle Combe, which had just been voted Europe's prettiest village by the Americans. And it was being attacked by 20th Century Fox, making a film in this beautiful village called Dr. Dolittle, which involved turning the little stream, thatched cottages, into a dirty great lake for filming, using a 20-foot-high concrete dam, ruining the village. And my friend decided to bring this outrage to the general attention by blowing up the entire concrete dam the night before the film started. Good PR plan. Unfortunately, the police got to hear about it. They put Alsatian dogs all over the dam, but my friend had been at Eton, so he was up to that one. What he did was to rent 8 Alsatian bitches in order to put them upwind of the dam. But at the last minute, the bitches failed to turn up, so he phoned me to ask if I would stand in. Because I had just completed an army explosives course where you learn to blow up as much as you can using as little as possible. And I was pretty good at this, so I had a lot left over at the end of every day. It seemed stupid to give it back to Her Majesty, so I put it in the boot. And 2 months later, the boot was full and sweating. And what better way of getting rid of it than this public-spirited gesture? Unfortunately, everybody was caught. I was not physically caught. I'd been doing another army course on how to escape from dogs by night. But they had the car numbers. I ended up in Chippenham Prison. I was on police probation for 6 months. I was thrown out of the SAS back to my own regiment, who was still retreating from the German border. Well, I put up with that for about another year, And then I saw a notice on the regimental board asking for officers to join the Sultan of Oman's forces. You look too young to remember, but back then, world Marxism was doing very well, and especially turning Muslim places into Marxist places. They had thrown the Brits out of the Yemen and were about to move into the Oman in order to block 80% of the free world's oil coming out of the Gulf. Therefore, the socialist prime minister in the UK agreed to send the Sultan of Oman a massive show of military strength, which he did. There were about 9 of us at that time. And I can remember applying for the job in Scotland, and all the other officers were being turned down due to being too valuable to the regiment. But my application went through immediately. And what the Ministry of Defense think is you cannot command Arabs in the dark being shot at by communists if you cannot speak Arabic. So first of all, you get sent to the best place in the world for learning Arabic, according to the ministry, which is Beaconsfield in North London. I did fail the course, but I was still sent out. And on arrival, you meet your, shall we say, works team for the first time. They were a piratical-looking group. Most of them, I discovered, were in fact Baluchi, so they could only speak Urdu. Many of them were Zanzibaris who spoke only Swahili, and the few that did speak Arabic had not been to Beaconsfield. So we ended with a major communication problem. But going back to motivation, it was probably out there that I began to get a taste for travel in very remote parts of the world. This is the navy of the Sultan of Oman. Ship was called Nasser al-Bakr. That was the army. This was my reconnaissance platoon, but we were about to attack Rakhut, held by communist machine guns, so they were sort of apprehensive and seasick. That was one half of the Sultan's air force, photographed obviously from the other half. Normally I can point at the screen, but I can only point at one screen, so I would try and explain things without pointing at them. It's a bit difficult. Basically, in that picture, you can see on the right-hand side, you've got an Omani. Then next to him, you've got a Zanzibari. Next to him, under the wheel there, you've got a Baluchi. 2 along from there, you've got me. All of us were, of course, Muslim. I was sort of Muslim for the 3 years that we were out there. There were about 450 of us in the Sultan's army, all volunteers, all from religions from the book, whether it was Christian or Muslim or whatever. Basically, we were fighting between 3,000 and 4,000 members of the People's Front for the Liberation of the Occupied Arabian Gulf, and they were trained and armed in the Soviet Union, mostly in Odessa. Very well armed. We had no helicopters, so you go into the enemy area, get badly wounded, you're not going to get them out except by donkey if you're very lucky. Now, I realized that in this new country, Arabia, there was mostly sand, but down there, you come out of the sand, which goes all the way up to Saudi Arabia, and ahead of you are these big mountains with water, rivers, waterfalls, wolves, hyenas, jackals, scorpions, all sorts of stuff which you don't really get in the sand in the desert. Suddenly, mountains. Now, my predecessor, a Scottish officer, had been killed in one of the Land Rovers by making bad mistakes. What he did was he used to go right close to the enemy-held mountains, go up to lay ambushes in the enemy area, and then after it's finished, coming back out again by day. No good at all. That's why he got killed. So I changed the tartib, the method out there. I changed it. They didn't like it to begin with, but soon they got used to it. I stopped the Land Rovers 20 miles out in the desert, and after dark, force marched into the mountains, lay your ambushes, do what you've got to do, then come out after dark. So for 2.5 years, we moved only by night and became very good at doing it. I also stopped them moving as 60 people together, big target. I made them move in little groups of 4 with walkie-talkie contact and 2 machine guns per group. That way, after 3 years, only 4 of us were killed against a big kill ratio of the Marxist group the other way around. But moving in the mountains by night was not good because you tread on a snake. There are more snakes in Dauphin, South Oman than any other country in the world. You get bitten by an Echis carpet viper, you'll be brain dead within 2 minutes. And we have the PM, which is even quicker. That is a Soviet anti-personnel mine. Very often, we would be sitting in a cave, fiqar, up on the mountains or on the edge of the hill on the Yemeni border, our side of the Yemeni border, waiting for the Idarat political execution squads from Hauf in the Yemen to come over to do extremely nasty things to the Muslim tribal leaders in order to change them into Marxist. We were there to kill them before they could do that. But very often you're sitting in a cave 6 days and nights, that's all the water you can carry. You're being bitten stupid by ticks and fleas and nothing happens. After 2.5 years, I was in London on leave and went to the British Museum because no botanist had ever been allowed into Dauphin. And the British Museum wanted new types of scorpion and lizard, so I was trained to recognize them. And while you're waiting for the Idarat, you might as well recognize lizards. So basically, if you do go to London, go to the British Museum, the scorpion department. There is a 28-inch long black scorpion with my name on it in Latin. I'm very proud of it. I stroke it when I go there. Chameleons, you might know, they grow out there to 23 centimeters long. If you put them on a green leaf, they go green. Put them on a red flower, they will turn red. People say if you put them on a tartan blanket, they will explode. The people are very interesting. We recognize 16 different tribes, like the Bautakhari, the Makhra, the Shakra, the Beit Kathiri, and so on, sometimes by the markings on the face. Some of them would have already gone Marxist. Basically, if you've read the Bible, you'll know about Sodom. People got naughty, so God covered them with sand. Maybe true, maybe not. In the Quran, definitely true, called Irem al-Adat. Now that is definitely a historical place. Marco Polo talked about it. And these guys were descended from the Queen of Sheba from Ethiopia, who colonized Dauphin at the same time that north in Jerusalem, Solomon was the king. And at that time, frankincense, incense, only grows in Dauphin, and it cost more than gold. So it was a good place for the Queen of Sheba to colonize. But by the time I got there, incense had lost its value, rather like oil can lose its value. And when I got out there, they were very poor indeed. If you can imagine you were born in that house of 3 rooms, I knew the people. You can see one of our Land Rovers. We brought them aspirin and rice when we could, but we were badly ambushed doing that, so we had to stop. I knew the 15 people in that family very well. Imagine you are born there. If you're lucky when you're 12 years old, you might marry someone better off. Over on the right-hand side, you've got the kitchen. In the middle, you've got the sitting room for 15 people, garage over on the left. Now, they depend on camel milk. No grass, no milk. What you do is you put your house on your camel and move off to find grass before your neighbor does. Not much of a life. Well, I got to love these people, but we had, unfortunately, to do a patrol. We were the only people patrolling the whole of the Saudi Arabian, Yemeni, Omani border. If you move too many times on the same track, they will lay anti-tank mines, blow a Land Rover 100 meters and the people further than that. Well, I had to leave, not because I wanted to, but because I was thrown out of the British Army, because I had been in the Army 8 years, which is the maximum you're allowed if you're not a regular officer because you have failed your exams from school. So I was a civilian. 1968, I got married. I'm talking about my late wife of 40 years, Ginny, and she also had no money. We decided what we would do because in the German army, in Germany in the Cold War, I had been training Scottish soldiers to ski and climb, and that's canoe and all that sort of thing. In the army, it was called adventure training, and it was to stop the soldiers beating each other up because they were bored because the Soviet army never bothered to attack. Now, that training was called adventure training, and the taxpayer paid. Doing it with my wife, the taxpayer no longer paid. So the new word was sponsorship, and it is still true today. Anyway, Ginny and I, started with our first expedition was to look for the lost city in the Rub al-Khali, the biggest desert in the world. And 1969, that picture was about the time of the Prophet, so maybe a bit romantic, but it was somewhere out in that desert. We started in 1969 looking for the lost city. 26 years later, Ginny and I found the lost city. It is now the biggest excavation works in Arabia. Some of you may have seen it in a place called Shissa. Anyway, that's another story. We started in a very small way, man and wife, to do expeditions. And I'll give you 2 examples out of 30 expeditions over 30 years. We tried to do the first journey. What happened is that my wife had the idea of what we would do next at breakfast. She decided we would do the first journey up the longest river in the world, on Nahar Nil, Egypt, of course, first, and that we would use hovercraft. They are the first hovercraft, 1968, 2 people in one, and they had the world record in the Guinness Book of Records because they had hovered without a breakdown for 8 hours around a gravel pit in Peterborough. So obviously the right model for the Nile. They had 3 motorbike engines which could lift them 2 centimeters above the surface. We took 9 months to complete the Nile, partly because there were a lot of 4-centimeter obstacles. Just to give you an idea how different these expeditions were, you may have heard of British Columbia, which is bigger than Britain and is a Canadian province. Well, it's full of forest all the way, and the Rocky Mountains, 2,500 miles from the Yukon border through 9 big rivers going to the United States border at Vancouver. Because they were having their centenary of being a Canadian province, and because Scottish people had discovered them in the first place, they wanted a Scottish expedition to do the first ever water journey down from border to border. I was asked to lead the expedition because by then I was on the Army Reserve, and the ministry in return promised me a support Land Rover BER. I later discovered that meant beyond economical repair. They also said if I went to Edinburgh, out of 600 soldiers, I could choose the best 3, but when I got there, I found they'd all been sent to Ireland apart from the cooks, so the choice was not good. But I did find a very fine Scotsman in the middle there called Joseph Skubinski, and the 3 of them were given a total of 6 weeks army leave. We took 8 months, so they were not popular when they got back. This was because none of us had been on bad water before, and yet the ministry only gave us training permission on the River Thames near London. So when we got to Canada, our learning curve was very steep. We had 4 boats, 3 people in each boat, and when we hit the Moran Canyon, which nobody had ever been through before and come out alive, when we went in there, one of our boats hit a 30-foot standing wave, was sent over. We found their bodies a mile downstream, and that could have stopped the entire expedition. But luckily, it was just the BBC film crew. Round about 1972, we had a problem, which was that in the UK, the media, and we depend, sponsors only come if you have media coverage, the media did not want any more hot expeditions like we had been doing. They only wanted very cold expeditions, polar expeditions. So at breakfast, Jenny decided that we would move into cold places, But we found you need to break records, and we found that the polar records, because there's only 2 poles, basically had all been achieved already by the enemy, the Norwegians. But there was one extremely difficult one they had tried and failed. Nobody had ever managed to go around Earth vertically. Christopher Columbus and people go around horizontally. Nobody by any route had been on the surface of Earth without flying for a meter of the 52,000 miles. So at breakfast, Ginny decided this is what we would do. She sent me to a library to find out the best route. I discovered that there was a white bit at the bottom called Antarctica, which looked problematic and had never been crossed from side to side by any route by anyone other than a big governmental pincer movement of 2 expeditions. This did not look good. Up at the top, which you can't see, you've got another problem called the North Pole. That is the Arctic Ocean. It's just a sea with bits of ice floating, 2,500 miles. So I went home, as you would, and I told my wife it was a stupid idea. She became quite unpleasant, so I therefore went back to the library. Basically, we spent, you need an office somewhere like London. We knew that the British Army was shrinking and had empty buildings. I went to the SAS and I asked if we could have their building near Sloane Square in the middle. The bloke said, but you were the man that caused us all that trouble with explosives 7 years ago. I said, well, yes, but I've matured since then. And we got the barracks, and Ginny and I spent 7 years unpaid every day except weekends when we worked in pubs to make a living, to get 1,900 sponsor companies, to get a 40-year-old ship, and so on and so forth. What happened was, for 3 years, Ginny and I concentrated on the ice problems. But then one day she said, well, unfortunately, we've got the Pacific and the Atlantic get in the way. We'll need a ship that is ice strengthened. And so we advertised for a deckhand. A week later, a bloke with a big black beard came, and Ginny thought that is good for a deckhand. And so we took him on, called Anton. And after that, delegation, anything to do with the ocean, Anton, the ice, Ginny, people and equipment, me, 7 years getting everything together. One day I heard Ginny saying to Anton, we will not accept any women on the ship. This is because women, if they were pretty, you got all these nasty men for 3 years on a ship, not good, trouble, yeah. So basically, that went ahead. And then the patron, Prince Charles, heard about it, and he said, no, you must accept women if they're prepared to give up their money. So Ginny and Anton said, yes, sir, and ignored him. Still wouldn't take women, but one woman was so stubborn they couldn't get rid of her, so she got made cook on the ship. And when we got down to Antarctica, she was still on the ship, and 4 men were keen on her. Big trouble was going to happen. Anyway, the ship, with 52 people from New Zealand, from Fiji, from everywhere, as I told you, all on that ship for 4 years with no pay. They dropped off the land group. The land group, I had to have 2 other people with me to do for 4 years, slowly going around Earth's surface. We had 800 applicants. People like you are prepared to give up your career for 4 years unpaid. We chose only 2. One of them had been a beer salesman in London for 9 years, Ollie. The other one, Charlie from Cape Town, had a butcher business down there which went wrong, so he joined the British Army. We chose them because of their characters, not their skill. You can't change character, you can teach skill. Anyway, the 3 of us were the land group, and the ship dropped us and the communicator, the base commander, 4 people. They said goodbye, and they went round to the Pacific Ocean in New Zealand and waited for 2 years, hoping that we would come out. The continent that we would be crossing is far bigger than China and India put together, but has no shops en route. This is why it had not been crossed. So the ship said goodbye, And the last thing that Ginny said to Anton was, "You are going to have to get rid of that woman before you collect us on the other side, or there will be murder on board." Anton said, "No problem." 2 years later, when we got the other side, the ship came. Ginny said, "How did you get rid of the woman?" And he looked very embarrassed, and he said, "I married her." The ship unloaded, and the wind gets up, the ice breaks, and you lose things back out to sea. The ship went away. We then moved, and again, I can't point out, unfortunately, but on the left of that picture was the sea, and we said goodbye to the ship, and then we moved inland for 400 miles to the last known place on Earth. There were no polar satellites at that time. If you want to know direction for 2,000 miles with nothing but white, you look at one watch on Greenwich time, the other one on local time, you look at the sun, and you know which way to go. If you want to know where you are, you use a theodolite, same as Captain Scott did 70 years ago. Only in the 90s did polar orbiting satellites bring you GPS, sat-nav, sat-phone, but not when we were there. So we said goodbye to the ship, we moved inland, and we got to 12,000 feet above sea level, and there we sat in a paper hut, very light. Our ski plane, which we'd got, we never flew, but we had to drop parachutes ahead. It dropped the hut off, and when we got to the last place on Earth, if you look just above the hut, you can see a rock on the horizon. That was the last feature on Earth, Rivingen, for 900 miles to the South Pole. How high? Nobody knew. It had never been mapped. We would be mapping it for the first time. We lived for 8 months in that hut. We insulated it down to minus 30 centigrade. We recorded that winter minus 122 degrees centigrade, so you might think we got cold. That could withstand 40-mile-an-hour wind. We recorded 166-mile-an-hour wind, so you might think we got blown over. But when Ginny designed the hut in Scotland 6 years earlier, out of hard paper, the snow would go up almost to the roof, giving you insulation and protection. But then, of course, you can't get out. You might think, well, why would you want to get out? And the answer basically is we would be for 8 months cooking with gasoline in a paper house. We had to learn how to communicate Morse code at that time. Ginny, my wife, became the base commander because the whole thing had been her idea in the first place. For 4 years in the Territorial Army signals, she learnt frequency prediction and got better at it than Marconi. She learnt in the Navy for 2 years training how to do Antarctic antenna theory and became excellent at that. We had to learn to cross crevasses, which in London is not sort of practical. Luckily, one opened up just outside the hut for training purposes. Normally, you cannot see the crevasses. It's just white. If you want to know where they are, you tread on them and fall in them, and then you know where they were. Basically, we lived 8 months in the huts. The sun came back. The thermometer rose to minus 68. So we said goodbye to the base commander. That is the nastiest job of all. That's why I gave it to my wife, because the whole thing had been her fault for thinking of it. But she was a small person and couldn't roll big drums of fuel around. Therefore, a man had to be living with my wife for 2.5 years. So I did not want somebody who was physically attractive in that position. But luckily, we found a Yorkshireman for that particular job. We did the first crossing of the entire 900 miles unexplored. We mapped it for the first time. Every picture I took for the 2,000 miles came out white, so there's no point showing them to you. 2,000 miles later, having used a tent that weighed 120 pounds, today our tent weighs 3 pounds, up there you have katabatic wind that goes from 0 to over 100 miles an hour in under 1 minute, so it doesn't give you long to put your tent up. Eventually, we reached the far side of the great continent. There is only one volcano that is active, and it smokes all the time. So for navigation, I could see the smoke for 400 miles, which was very helpful. I knew that when we called the ship with Morse code, it would come in by that volcano. Normally, again, I could show you on the map, but if you look at the red line, when Ginny made the plan 9 years before we got there, she did it on her 6-inch school globe with a crayon, so the planning was not exactly precise. But she reckoned if we got across Antarctica, we would send a message to New Zealand, the ship would try to come through the floating ice and rescue us. They did. 2 other big ships sunk that year trying to get through. The ship was very wonderful to see them. They were still unpaid, which was good. 2 of them were dead, but the rest were okay. Went up to Australia, and then if you look on the map, across the sea to Los Angeles, up the coast to Vancouver, up in the top left-hand side, you can see just the tip of the Soviet Union, and then Alaska. Now, if we went into the Arctic, our ship would sink. Therefore, when she made the plan, the ship would drop off 3 of us in rubber boats at the mouth of the Yukon River, which is that red line. We would then go 1,800 miles in the boats up the Yukon. The ship would go through the Panama Canal and wait for 18 months and hoping we would come out. We would go up the Mackenzie River to the Arctic Sea. You can see islands up there. We would then, in one open boat, try to do the first open boat journey for 2,500 miles across the top of Canada. It's called the Northwest Passage. And then, if the sea had not yet frozen, 900 miles to the last island on Earth, where we would wait 8 months of darkness. On the Yukon River, no problems, except there were now only 2, not 3, because the beer salesman, after 8 years without pay, planning it all, had been threatened with divorce, so he left. Charlie from South Africa and I, we carried on. When we got to the Northwest Passage, if you can imagine, that is the black line at the bottom of the picture is Canada for 2,500 miles. We went west-east. From the pole, 500 miles away from Canada, all that ice in summer is being sent against Canada. So that is why in the past many expeditions never got through in big boats, never mind little boats. We had a huge storm, thanks to God, for 8 days, which sent the ice away, and we managed to get through 2,000 miles to where the sea began to freeze. That's called Nylas. 2 hours with no wind, and the ice will freeze, and the boat will become useless. We had to abandon the boat. 11 years later, a Canadian icebreaker found the boat and took it away. It's now in a museum, but that did not help us at the time. We had 400 miles to go on foot over unmapped mountains to get to the edge of the world. The other guy, the South African, Charlie, he's dead now, sadly, on the left-hand side. In the boat, his feet got wet and the skin fell off 1 foot. So he had to do 400 miles on snowshoes with open nerves, and his language got bad. He then developed hemorrhoids, and his language got worse. And then one day he fell over and he cracked his head open on a rock, and his eyes filled up with blood, and he started to complain. He basically said we ought to rest. If we had rested, we would have ended up dead, and all the other people, 52, had given up all that time because we could not do our bit. He's a great guy, Charlie. I've got a picture of his better foot at that time. We did 400 miles to the edge of the world. Ginny, in the summer, in a ski plane, had dug snow out of one hut, which scientists had abandoned 30 years before. There were 2 huts. We eventually got there. I've got a picture of one of the huts. We spent 8 months living in the little hut. There was the dog, Ginny's dog, and Ginny, and Charlie, and me. 8 months we spent there in the dark. Then I have to say that the dog was a nuisance, but later became the pet of the year in the UK, and the only dog ever to get into the Guinness Book of Records for having peed on both poles. 8 days after we left, it caught fire. We said goodbye to Ginny. For 8 months. We would be trying to cross the top of the world via the North Pole. For 500 miles, that's what it looked like. At the pole, we became the first people ever to reach both poles by surface travel. We put a flag there, but it's pretty stupid to do that because within 1 hour, the flag will be a long way from the pole because the ice is sort of floating. If you go there and you want to put your flag there, make a hole in the ice, swim down 17,000 feet to the seabed, put your flag there, and it will stay put. We did not do that. At the pole today, if people go to the North Pole, they will get a helicopter out before summer. After summer, it's very dangerous. Everything is weak and breaking up. We could not get out at the pole because we still had 1,800 miles to go to get down to land, the Soviet Union or Greenland. We actually only got 400 miles before it became too dangerous to continue. We sat on a bit of ice, hoping it would withstand the pressure of big ice flows, and we sat there for weeks and months, floating south. The other guy, Charlie on the left, had a solar panel which gave us enough power to listen to the BBC World Service for 2 minutes a day, if there was reception. And I can remember on one particular day, with his headsets on, Charlie said, "The United Kingdom is at war." So I said, "Who with?" He said, "Oh, I didn't get that bit." We sat for 5 days of bad radio reception, arguing who the hell we could be at war with. We knew that Mrs. Thatcher was aggressive, but we could not work out who with. Of course, we assumed it was France, but when they said it was Argentina, we thought that was just a stupid BBC joke. We also did not get bored because we got visited. 800 miles from people, it's quite frightening when you hear the door like opening. They weigh 1.5 tons. The Canadian government had promised me that Canadian polar bears, only 10% eat human beings. But when they're outside your door, you can't ask them which percent they belong to. Our main worry was not the bears, it was the fact that our home, on which we had been sitting and floating for 3 months, had begun to sink. Ice was coming, water over the tent floor. We sent a panic Morse code message to Greenland, to the ship and my wife, to come early. They tried to come early, but the ice was so hard it cracked the hull and the ship began to sink. Cleverly, they rammed ice so that the hole was in the air, and they had to go back for 2 months. And on the ice, Charlie and I panicked. Luckily, 4 years earlier, Ginny had designed canoe skis so that if this happened, we could still travel from ice to ice. We never dared get in the canoe because by then we were too weak and the ice could move too fast. Basically, the ship tried 5 times to get north and got stuck further north than any other ship in the north. For 15 days they were stuck. Again, I would show you with my torch, but if you look carefully to the left of the ship, you can see us. We had been 8.5 months out on the moving sea ice. When we got back on the ship, human beings, for the first and last time in history, had been around Earth's vertical surface. Many more people have been on the moon. We kept our team together in the 1980s and 90s. If you've got a good team, keep them together. We moved against the Norwegians to break all world records of unsupported polar travel north and south. We used aerospace technology so that we could tow 500-pound loads, Norwegians still maximum of 250. We used systems with no amphibious gear so that we could go where previously you'd have to wait for that to freeze. Gorbachev, 92, Moscow, perestroika. So I wrote a letter, "Dear Mr. Gorbachev, can I lead the first Western expedition from Siberia to the pole instead of normally Canada to the pole like the Norwegians were still doing?" Gorbachev said yes, but the only place you can set out from because of the ice is Arktyczki, and that was a secret Soviet missile base. So I had to sign a contract that while I was there, I would take no photographs. I did not. The other members of the team did. Back in the UK, after breaking all world records for the next 9 years from Siberia, back in the UK, I discovered, not the Norwegians this time, but the NASA in Pasadena, California, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. They were putting cameras on the shuttle, flying up to 170 kilometers and taking photographs of Oman and of the great Rub al-Khali desert. They were looking for the lost city in the Quran. Now, Ginny and I had been looking for that city for 25 years, and we were about to find it with help from the Sultan of Oman. So it was very annoying having NASA looking for our lost city with technology they had we did not have, like the shuttle. Basically, again, I can't point at it, but that is a NASA professor. Down where it's blue is the Indian Ocean. Up to the north is Saudi Arabia, of course. 300 miles into the sand dunes, NASA said that is where the lost city is. They look at the shuttle photo through bioptics, and although the city outline was 30 feet under the sand, they could still see it. It's called cheating. And they basically knew that it was a lost city because it was right angles, and only people make things with right angles, so it's got to be a lost city. Well, I'm not going to tell you how in the UK, it wasn't WikiLeaks, we discovered the NASA site 8 months before they could mount their ground expedition. Land Rover gave us 8 special vehicles. We moved out 300 miles into the Rub al-Khali, and my archaeologist, the best in the world, took one look at the NASA site, and he said, this is not the lost city. This is a place made by God using right angles in order to fool NASA. We reverted to traditional archaeology, and on the 23rd of November, after 26 years looking for it, we found the lost city in the Sultanate of Oman, not in Saudi Arabia. It is now the biggest excavation works in Arabia, as I said earlier. Just to end up with, I'm going to miss out a great number of expeditions. This picture was drawn by an Irish guy in 1908. He wanted to cross Antarctica before anybody else. From South America, his ship would drop 4 of them on the edge. They would walk to the South Pole. When they got there, they would die of hunger. You cannot carry enough food. Therefore, from Australia at the bottom, 2 years earlier, his other ship, that lot would drop food off on the other half of the pole. Well, what happened was his ship sunk, so he never set out. He could not tell the others, so they did set out. They were killed and did not drop the food off, so that if Shackleton had reached the pole, he would have died anyway, but it was a good plan. It was copied 40 years later by governmental expeditions using closed vehicles so you don't die of hypothermia. So when I'm talking about 92, only 4 of us had ever crossed Antarctica. The blue line from north to south, that was my wife's round the world I told you about. The red line, 1990s, American. The diagonal, New Zealand, UK. And the yellow line, the top climber in the world from Italy, Messner, and Germany's top polar man, Arvid Fuchs. All of us use some form of air support. But now, in the 1990s, what was happening, and I'll tell you, remember I said there's 52 people in our group. 2 of them, in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, their only job for us has been to put huge radio masts in their vegetable patch in Aberdeen and listen in on 3 to 30 megahertz high frequency to the Norwegians so that we know what they are planning to do. Then we can do it first. 92 from Aberdeen, telephone, you're going to have to hurry. The Norwegians are about to do the big one, which is to cross the whole of the continent of Antarctica with nothing except what you carry on day 1. So you are taking 500 pounds for 2,000 miles with no help. We knew that you would die of hunger, but if your main rivals are planning it, you can't give them a clean start. So very quickly, we got a team together, caught the only aeroplane going to Antarctica's biggest airport. You can see the control tower on the left-hand side there. We flew 1,900 miles over nothing to the start point, which is where the frozen Atlantic hits Antarctica. Same day, 100 miles away, the Norwegian team set out. Our team, there were two of us. The guy in blue is Europe's #1 physiologist. He specializes in studying the effects of starvation on the human body, so in his element on this expedition. We towed 500 pounds each. That is nearly 200 pounds more than any other previous man haul. He monitored our calorie output, which was an average for 3 months of 11,500 calories a day. If you use a marathon, you might run 2,000. We could only eat 5,000, that's what we could carry, so we became very thin very quickly. Even Weight Watchers would not recommend it. You can't wear Gore-Tex clothing like normal, you would die of hypothermia. Towing 500 pounds at -50, you sweat. As soon as you stop, you get cold and hypothermic. So you have to wear something that is totally breathable. You cannot wear the normal shoes to protect your feet. You have to wear rigid boots that dig skins in so that you can pull 500 pounds for 2,000 miles. But that is what happens very quickly to your feet. Very painful for an hour in the morning. Then they get cold and stop hurting. Gangrene, that's after 3 weeks. We knew that after 3 months we would have to have skin grafts. Sydney, Australia, ozone hole, skin cancer. Much worse where we were. You're under the hole. You've got to cover up your skin. But remember, you are towing a huge weight on a dog harness. You're breathing like hell. You can't cover up your mouth. Therefore, very quickly, your lips get very badly hurt. In the tent at night, you sleep, your lips stick together. When you wake up in the morning, the first thing you do is to share porridge out of one bowl. So you open your mouth by pulling the scabs apart. All your blood goes in his porridge, which causes bad relations. I took that picture just to see if you were still awake. I ask you a question. What is the time on Mike's watch when I took that photograph? Okay, the sun is due north at midday. He's treading on his shadow. He wants to go to the South Pole, so it must be midday on his watch. That is how we navigated 2,000 miles without a feature. I took a picture of that crevasse because normally you can't see anything, it's just white. That's why I developed a very careful personal policy, which is to watch the man ahead. Nobody's going to go down that one. You'd be pretty stupid. You could see the hole at the top. At the South Pole, the Norwegians dropped out pretty much dead. The only reason we carried on was because Dr. Stroud, Mike, had a contract with Europe's top medical magazine, The Lancet, on the topic of advanced starvation. And at the pole, he weighed us and found that we were starving even more than he had hoped. And he was determined to complete the article, even if it was posthumous. So we carried on. We did the first ever descent of the 9,000-foot Beardmore Glacier without crampons, because we'd lost them. I began to hate him. A great guy, I've done 28 years with him since, but on that expedition, every 5 days he takes your blood for science. Didn't have much blood left. Every 8 days he makes you drink a container of liquid costing $1,000, and for 24 hours after you drink it, any liquid coming out of your body, especially urine, has to be collected in bottles. And I can assure you that outside in a wind at -50, filling a pee bottle is very dangerous for that part of your body if you are male. Although, obviously, at that temperature, the difference between males and females is not great. His hands became problematic. When the blisters fall off, you get totally raw finger. A little bit after that, I made a mistake for 3 minutes, as a result of which 5 months later, I had to have the top half of all those fingers amputated. You don't want to make mistakes in those conditions. Mike and I reached the far side of the great continent without support, the first people ever to do so. Today, it is the longest polar journey unsupported in history. Back in Europe, we completed 19 muscle biopsies for science without anesthetic, very painful. I enjoyed taking that photo of Mike. We raised from that expedition the sum of 4.2 million and started building Britain's first multiple sclerosis research centre. As of last year, the expeditions have raised £19 million for different charities. All the expedition have a charity and a science program, but that is not it from my point of view. It's my profession. I need sponsorship, and to continue to get sponsorship, we need to stay ahead of our known rivals at all times. Stephen?
Am I allowed onto the stage now? Marvelous. I cannot tell you how awe-inspiring all of that is, and also how funny. So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and then I want a little bit of time to get the questions from everybody here. But that thing about funny is important, I think. I mean, you have been through the most extraordinary physical experiences, the most horribly gruesome physical pain in the course of these expeditions, and yet the way you tell them indicates to me that even in the crappiest of crappy times, you kept a sense of humor. Did you?
Well, that question is a good question, but it leads back to, do you choose people on your team who have a sense of humor? Or in fact, why do you choose people? 800 people, we only wanted 2. How do you choose them? Well, we don't have the time or the money to look at 800 people. But in London, there is a regiment of SAS Territorial who have a selection course, and that got rid of 98% of 800 people without us having to spend any time. They selected the people. We then spent in the mountains of Wales for 3 or 4 years looking at the 2% who came through. And when we are looking at them and select them, we notice certain things. One is that if they have a religious faith, that will be very helpful to their strength of motivation, their sense of humor, and so on, when we get to the selection final process. So we found that. We don't know why. It doesn't matter what faith, as long as they've got a faith. I mean, I got brought up in South Africa, and the faith was called Anglican, and I've still got it. But when you're out there, you've got things falling off, your fingers, your toes. If you eat chocolate, which is frozen, your fillings fall out. We had 19 fillings from 3 people on one expedition. And you have crutch rot, particularly if you are male. So walking is very painful. And my religion is strong, but it's not sort of strong enough to deal with sort of crutch rot. So therefore, I have an additional, how can I put it, strong way. I suppose it's humorous in a bit of a way, which is that I imagine that the 2 people I respect most in my life, my father and my grandfather, I didn't meet either of them, but I got brought up by my mother on stories, and I imagine that they are watching me out in Antarctica, and I do not want to do something to make them ashamed, like being the first to give up. But I am wanting to give up. So when this nasty voice comes into your head saying, I want to give up, I want to give up, that is how I deal with it. But in the tent at night, I am looking around at the others, hoping that one of them has broken his leg. That I won't be the first to give up.
Is there any expedition ever where you did give up? Not because of a technical malfunction or because the machine that was supposed to get you from A to B just broke, but because you decided, you know what, I can't complete this one?
Yes, when we were on the 5th attempt after 15 years looking for the Irem al-Adat in the desert, we came over a huge sand dune and we saw a pillar, like a Roman pillar, and we got the champagne out, we found the lost city, this is wonderful, and our archaeologist, the best in the world, Dr. Yuri Zarins from Missouri, took one look at the pillar, and he got his team, they were all blonde from Missouri University, and got them digging. But 2 months later, although the wind is meant to cover things, it hadn't covered this pillar, which was odd. And we could find nothing else, just the pillar. And after 2 months, Yuri said that he was frightened. What happens is, when you're doing polar expeditions, the enemy are Norwegians. When you are in Oman, in the desert, doing archaeology, the enemy are the German archaeologists. And Yuri reckoned that the German archaeologists had hired a helicopter to drop the pillar to keep us busy. Anyway, this, to answer your question, had a very bad effect on my morale. I've been so happy finding it after 5. So I said, that is the last time we look for the lost Omani city. My wife, who spoke very good Arabic, said, no, we will continue looking for it however long it takes. And on the 8th expedition, we found it by sheer good luck with a bit of help from NASA. Yeah.
Ginny is such a character in these stories, even though obviously, unfortunately, we can't meet her, but you said you were married for 40 years. You went through the most extraordinary things together, and interestingly, you describe how you plan the mega missions together, including the traversing of the poles and the planet via the poles. And she and you both must have known that you were pushing the edge of what was survivable. And it's clear it must have been the most amazing. I mean, me and my wife, we managed to have ferocious rows just driving to the supermarket. And, you know, you've done a bit more than that. But did you have a pact that you both agreed that what you were both seeking to do, the adventures you were having, the records you were trying to break, was worth the risk of death?
Yeah, I mean, when we started, there was no charity involved. But as we got more and more money for, first of all, cardiac and then cancer, it became in itself, you know, great, we got that. If we do that, we'll make another £2 million or something. So that was an additional. But most of all, when we got going on the polar expeditions, we found that if you look over your shoulder, there are always Norwegians. And worse still, sometimes you look front and they're ahead of you, sort of thing. And we began to get very competitional against those Norwegians. And
you're telling me that was that competitive urge and drive was enough for you both to feel it is worth that very obvious risk of ending up dead?
Absolutely, except that when we looked at the previous attempts to do that particular record, when we looked at them, why did the previous people not get it? Why did they fail? And it was always because they took a risk. And we therefore planned everything to avoid risks and unpleasantness and painfulness. You can't avoid them entirely, but quite honestly, statistically in the UK, it is far more dangerous to be a salesman driving on the motorways than ever going on polar expeditions. And I now have a 12-year-old.
I'm wondering if that's actually really true.
I have a 12-year-old daughter now, so you might think, well, it's selfish to do that. But, you know, I've got a wonderful wife who looks after her very well, and I got brought without a father, and, you know, my mother was wonderful, so I don't take that as being an argument.
Yes. Very, very, very interesting. Well, I could ask Ranulph questions all day, but it's not really why I'm here. I'm here to help everybody ask questions. So let's start here, and then we can go here. We'll get the microphone. We don't have that long, but I don't think we should end right now because this is so interesting. So go ahead.
Hi, my name's Raj. Thank you for everything that you've committed your life to. In your story, you spoke about some highs and some lows, but didn't allude to congratulating or consoling moments. If you could look back on this wonderful life of yours and just select two moments, one where you would go back and congratulate yourself, and one where you would go back and console yourself, could you speak on what those two moments might be, please?
Yeah, to console myself, I would say it's a waste of time. It's crying over spilt milk, and time is short as you get older, so I don't look at that one. But the other question was, which one will be most happy with? Well, I think, to be boring, finding the lost city we were very, very happy with, and I went to see His Majesty Sultan Qaboos, and he was happy because we'd found it on the correct side of the Saudi border. And so, yeah, we were very happy with that one. But also, there was a mountain, you probably haven't heard of it, it's in Germany, it's called the AHIC, and the North Wall is a bad problem. And we once spent 3 days and nights going up this sort of wall and to try and get rid of vertigo. And the guide had taught me how never think of what is below you, only think of what is above you, and certainly never look below you. And so this was a major thing to try to do because of the fear, which is natural to me, of vertigo. So when we got eventually to the top on the third night, I was particularly happy with that one, even though not like finding a lost city.
I'm such a wuss, I'm already worried about doing the zip wire with you. Is that,
Yes.
that's the tip, is it? We've got to look up, not down.
I don't know about zip wires. Yeah.
Thank you. Much of this, I'm guessing, has to do about curiosity and your inbuilt curiosity. So which explorers and what travel literature piqued your boyhood curiosity?
Sorry, which explorers?
Which explorers and which travel stories from the past?
Travel literature.
Yeah, literature. Which of them really piqued your interest? Do you remember, as a young man or a kid, particular travel books or individuals who you became preoccupied with?
Yeah, I'm not saying that anybody would have heard of them without the studying, but there's a guy called Wilfrid Thesiger,
Yes.
who most of his time was in the Rub al-Khali, sometimes with the Sultan of Oman, sometimes with the Wali of Salalah, and with his friends from Bedu friends. And he did the most amazing journeys in the 1950s, and he discovered places to do with the frankincense trade down in the Jabal Qamar, and I studied that very closely because it helped us look for the lost city. And then there was a guy called Scott, Captain Scott, who wanted to go to the South Pole, and I was in Moscow giving a present from my American boss to Mrs. Gorbachev, yeah? And in the conversation, she said, you do polar stuff, because we did stuff from Siberia as well. And did I know that Captain Scott was a friend of Stalin and had the hero of the Soviet Union, but that she had learnt from a book written by some British guy that it was all a load of lies and Scott was no good at all. And I then looked at this and I found that the guy that wrote the book told a load of lies in 1979, which completely assassinated the record of this guy Scott from 1912, I think, or 10, when he was killed in a tent down in Antarctica, and missed out the fact that he was the first guy to penetrate. So you can't not make mistakes if you're the first person in a new continent, and yet he discovered huge scientific stuff, including the fact that Antarctica was a continent. He was a great guy who today is more lied about than any of the earlier explorers. So hot Thesiger, cold Scott.
I think we've got a question here.
Yes, you spoke a lot about motivations, and I would like to ask a question about inspiration. You actually inspired me to join the British military, incidentally, and as you have been an inspiration to me, who was the one individual that was a constant inspiration to you? and inspired you to the greatness that you have achieved?
Yeah, I'd love to say something interesting, but what inspired me to take the expeditions going was purely because of lack of A-levels. If I had received the A-levels, I would have done what I wanted to do, which would have been what my father did with that particular regiment. And I regret that to this day. So it was a negative inspiration. Yeah. Sorry.
Right, we've perhaps got time for a couple more. There's a gentleman there and one there, so let's get, where are our microphones? There's a gentleman over there. Put your hand up again, sir. There you go.
Thank you. Hello? What great
It's on, go on. Oh, no, it's not.
Shout.
It's nearly on, but not quite.
It doesn't like. Oh, here we go. What great adventures are
I'm sure it's a great question, but it's not quite.
left? What great adventures are left?
What great adventures are there left?
You're sort of saying, what are we sort of going to do next? And I'm afraid, I don't want to be rude, obviously, but I don't know. There's no Norwegians in here.
Are you a Norwegian? Oh, you're just waving. I thought you were saying I'm a Norwegian. No, he's not a Norwegian, is he? Oh, he is Norwegian.
Oh, right.
Oh, well, in that case,
So you know our enemy Erling Kagge, or Borge Auslund, or Ragnar Thorsketh. Yeah, enemy number one.
so you're saying you're so paranoid and still so competitive that you wouldn't want the Norwegians to get a whisper of what you're doing next?
Well, about 40 years after we've confronted them in front of 800 people in the Royal Geographical Society, that particular one is now the top publisher in Norway, and he's a good friend, but doesn't forgive the past.
No. Do you ever go to Norway to meet the enemy?
I go to Norway, not to meet the enemy. No, and Ragnar became a Viking shipman. I met him on the Thames when he came there, and we'd forgotten past problems.
You buried a few hatchets. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. I think we had a question here. Yeah.
Good evening, sir. Which is one quality or virtue that you like the most and dislike the most in Chris and Anton, your partners?
Right. What do you like the most and dislike the most in your longtime partners, Chris and Anton?
Chris.
Chris. Well, let's start with Chris then.
I know Anton, he's the ship guy.
Yes.
Chris who?
That wasn't Chris, was it? You mean the starvation expert?
The other gentleman,
Which one?
and on the expedition.
There were two main guys, Dr. Michael Stroud, who I'm still doing stuff with.
And he's the starvation
He's
guy.
a starvation man. And the other one was Ollie and Charlie. And Charlie was the one who, sadly, Charlie died. He smoked too much. And soon after we did that, he died. He was a great guy. He was from South Africa, basically. And then when he went, Ginny found the other guy, Mike Stroud. So the two of them, wonderful. Are you saying which of the two was best?
No, he's saying what was the thing you liked about them most and disliked about them most?
Right. What I disliked most about Charlie was that he smoked like a chimney, and I was trying to give up. So it was very, very difficult. Mike Stroud, what I think I dislike the most, basically, is that he is in charge of our food, and you cannot argue with him because he's a nutrition expert. And in the tent, maybe after 3 months, you get very hungry. The rations are planned by him. You can't carry more than 5,200 calories because you've got to carry it, and there's a limit to the number of weight. So what he does is he stuffs it with fat, 69% fat for 3 months. That's probably why I had a massive heart attack at the end of it. He doesn't accept the blame, but there you go. And that is because fat, you get more calories for much less weight than you do with carbohydrates and proteins. So just following that, forgetting about all the damage to cardiac, that is what he does. And it's pretty, it's not appetizing at all. But after a month, you get so hungry, it becomes appetizing. And there is only one thing which is really delicious, and that is called a flapjack. And it's made by hand. And every day when he's doling out the rations in this little tent, he gives you one of the 2 flapjacks. And I found after about 60 days that the one I got was always smaller than the one he had. But you can't say that because it's bad for relations. You mustn't start things like that. So I stopped. But after 80 days, I couldn't any longer. So I said, Mike, don't you think every other day I should get to choose the flapjack? And he said, yes. So I could have actually done it a lot earlier. But after another 15 days, remember, you're sitting in the tent. It's tiny. You do not eat your good stuff, like your chocolate bar and your flapjack, until last. Because if you eat it early, you've got to watch him crunching away, looking happy, last thing. So it's sitting there in between you, and you do it last thing when he's started to eat his. And after 80 days, as I watched them sitting there, even though I had selected it, it still looked smaller than his. You know, hunger makes you a very nasty person. Yeah.
Sir Ranulph, talking of hunger, unfortunately, I've had a message saying we have to stop because it's not exactly like we're on the edge of starvation like you and Dr. Mike, but we do have to stop for lunch. Before we do, I've got one really daft question. Forgive me, but it's a one-word answer, really. But given where we're at and all of the people involved in travel and tourism here, where do you go on your holidays? I can't imagine anywhere that on holiday would stop you being bored. Where do you go on holiday?
It's a place called Exmoor.
Ah.
Yeah. That bloke towing the sledge to me with lorry
the tires, yeah.
That is Exmoor.
And that's the place you love.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, it is time for lunch, but I can pretty much, I think, speak for all of us, saying we will not forget hearing these most extraordinary, incredible, inspiring stories from Sir Ranulph Fiennes. So please do give him the warmest of thank yous. Thanks so much. Thank you.